boundaries that God promised to Abraham. The smaller one includes the green and the purple, and these are the boundaries that are listed here in Numbers chapter 34. And then the smallest one, the green one, that one is a set of boundaries that are actually settled by the people of Israel in the Transjordan, not the Cisjordan. Cisjordan is east of the Jordan. Transjordan is where they settled. No, I did that backwards. Eric's wrinkling his eyebrows at me. We'll just go with east and west so I don't mix up my prefixes. The majority of the tribes of Israel settled in the green area, and then Gad, Manasseh, half of Manasseh, and Reuben settled to the west, to the east of the Jordan River. And so in that land, we have we have the places where they actually settled, okay? That probably wasn't very clear. Let me try again. God promised Moses a particular range of territory for his descendants. And that is all of that territory that you see, the green, the purple, and then the diagonal lines. The boundaries that the people of Israel actually settled in the initial conquest is the green blob, plus a little bit across the river that was settled by Gad, Reuben, and half the tribe of Manasseh. The boundaries mentioned here in chapter 35 include the purple section as well. Okay, but they didn't actually settle in the purple section at this time. Now, the people of Israel, at their largest expansion, which would have been under King Solomon, King David, also perhaps some of the more profitable and excellent kings of Judah, Uriah, for example, they wouldn't have covered all the territory described by the diagonal lines. They would have had the territory of the green and the purple. Okay? So there's some limitations there. Interestingly, one thing that's important to notice here is even if you were to consider all the areas that are on this map, if you were to take all of them into account, Israel was not to be a very large nation, were they? This looks big because it's on a big screen, but on a globe, this would be a really small little bit of territory, really, okay? God did not design Israel to be a world empire. He did put them at the crossroads of the Middle East. Commerce had to go through this area because you can't exactly ride a horse across the Mediterranean Sea. And really, it's hard to ride large groups of horses across the wilderness that is east of the Jordan River. There's no real good way to get commerce across that great wilderness. There's not enough oases. And so almost all the commerce of the ancient Near East would pass through this strip of land. So God did not design them to be an empire by means of conquest, but when they were obedient to him and blessed, through Israel flowed all of the wealth of that region of the world. Through them went all of that, and also because of the blessing that God would give them, representatives of all the powerful nations of that region would pass through Israel, and in passing through they would see. You remember when Bathsheba visited? Bathsheba. Folks, I'm having a rough time. The Queen of Sheba. You know, there's something there. Remember when the Queen of Sheba visited Solomon and saw what she saw? She was traveling along trade routes that her people traveled along. She brought goods with her that her merchants would have been passing through Israel on a regular basis with. That's how she learned about Solomon. So when the Queen of Sheba comes and visits, what is happening is what God wanted to happen. The nations around that region were to pass through and into Israel and see, wow, this is the place that God is blessing. So they weren't to be a world power, an empire, but through the blessing that God put upon them, they were to broadcast his excellence throughout all of the world. And this is something that did on occasion, sometimes rare occasions, but did on occasion happen. Only under a couple of situations did Israel end up in territory that God had not designated for them. The big example, of course, being the territory that they acquired, which Reuben, Gad, and half the tribe of Manasseh currently occupy at the time that we are looking at the book of Numbers, the territory of Sihon and Og, because they came out and attacked Israel. These borders, as they are dictated by the Lord. Now, most of the time, Israel did not expand to the outer limits of these borders. Because they were not blessed, because they were not obedient, because they were not courageous. They were smaller than what God intended them to be. But these are the borders, such as they are, of the promised land, of the land that God promised, the place where God said, when you live here in obedience, you will be blessed. These are the boundaries of the land and the people that they were to drive out. Now, the list of tribal chiefs in verses 16 through 29 gives us just a little bit of detail about who was going to organize the parceling out of the land. These men are listed because very soon Eleazar is going to gather together with these men, and they're going to cast lots, a sort of a random way, with the Urim and the Thummim probably, of designating who would get which territory. This designation wouldn't figure out the size of the territory. Instead, it would indicate the location of the territory. Size was decided by the actual population of each tribe. These men were chosen by God, and it would seem to imply that they were thus prophetically designated to survive the conquest of the land. And they were to go forward as leaders of their tribes and be the representatives who received each parcel of land and who were themselves in charge of apportioning their land by parcel to the clans and to the families that were under them. So that's why we have this list of tribal chiefs. The only one in here that has multiple mention throughout God's word is Caleb. All the rest of them, they seem to be uniquely mentioned here. But there were men that were specifically chosen by God. God said these guys are the heads of the tribes in the main land of Israel. Obviously, omitted from that are 3.5 tribes. We've already accounted for 2.5 of them, right? Reuben, Gad, half the tribe of Manasseh. They're on the other side of the Jordan River, and their territory is there, and they asked for that. And some of the consequences of that at the end of the book of Joshua are some of the most interesting passages in the narrative of Israel's conquest. I really enjoy those texts. But the other tribe that hasn't been accounted for yet is the tribe of Levi. And we know from Numbers 18:23 that they are not to have an inheritance of land with the other tribes of Israel. But God did provide this extended list. The extended list is actually in Joshua 21, but he provides for them lots of cities, a total of 48, 42 plus 6 cities of refuge that we'll cover in just a minute. And he stipulates that in addition to these cities, they're supposed to have a certain amount of pasture land surrounding the cities, and in this pasture land they're supposed to be able to keep their flocks and keep their herds. And they would have been receiving a lot of tithes by way of flocks and herds, clean animals for use in the sacrificial system. Also, these cities being scattered throughout the land of Israel would make it much more practical for taxes to be collected, because you weren't taking all of your goods to the tabernacle or to the temple or to the city of Jerusalem all the time. Instead, you just take it to the nearest Levite city, which would certainly be, because of the multiplicity, would be less than a day's journey away. The amount of land that was designated around these cities, and I know this is more like classroom lecture, we'll get to sermon stuff here in just a minute. The amount of land that is around these cities that was designated for their flocks is, if you read the text there, it's a little, it could go one way or the other. Let's read that section. In 35:4 it says, "The pasture land of the cities which you shall give to the Levites shall reach from the wall of the city outward 1,000 cubits all around. You shall measure outside the city on the east side 2,000 cubits, on the south side 2,000 cubits, on the west side 2,000 cubits, on the north side 2,000 cubits, the city being in the middle, and they shall belong to them as pasture land for their cities." So it sounds to me like there's 2 different measurements going on here. The first one is that from the wall of the city out, it's supposed to be 1,000 cubits, okay? And that's in verse 4. But in verse 5, it says from the east side you're supposed to go out 2,000 cubits, and so on in all the other directions. And so it looks like it's doubling it. And there's some debate in the research that's been done on this about why that is. To put it into modern terms, modern distances, it looks like maybe this would have been something like a quarter to a half a mile of territory from the wall out that they were to have for their flocks and for their herds. And the central location was the city itself. So Levi's presence, the people of Levi, their presence was to be scattered throughout the people of Israel. This was to make taxes possible, but it also put what should have been religious experts within striking distance of everyone in the land. The people of Levi, specifically the priestly families, they were to be helping the rest of the people of Israel understand and live by the law. They were to be the ones who upheld the justice that was to be understood in God's kingdom. Now, for those of you who are following the morning devotionals, we will recognize from the few final chapters in the book of Judges that they were not doing their job as we look at the account of Micah and the Levite in the first couple of devotionals starting tomorrow and the day after. It doesn't turn out that way. They were supposed to be doing something to help the people remain faithful, and they didn't. So they were given 42 cities, and 6 of those 42 cities were also called cities of refuge. And that's in chapter 36, verses 9 through 34. Now, the book of Numbers has got a lot of case law in it. And the case law usually begins with a phrase like, "And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying," and then you have this law. Many of the times that we've run into case law here in the book of Numbers, it's been because a perplexing situation came up, and that perplexing situation escalates to Moses, and Moses says, "Well, I don't know what to do about this. God, what should we do?" And then God gives them case law. God says, well, in this situation, from this time and going forward, throughout all the history of Israel under the law, you're supposed to do things this way. So this is case law for the cities of refuge. Now, in this instance, this is not given because a situation came up that needed clarification. This is given so that they can have justice in the land when they finally settle in it. So case law here from the Lord. It is revelation. God wants justice among his people done in this way. And the point of all of this is that the people of God are supposed to be set apart as holy unto the Lord. And as we see here, the cities of refuge play an important role in that. I want to read just a little section of this. So Numbers 35, starting in verse 9, the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to the people of Israel and say to them, when you cross the Jordan into the land of Canaan, then you shall select cities to be cities of refuge for you, that the manslayer who kills any person without intent may flee there. The city shall be for you a refuge from the avenger, that the manslayer may not die until he stands before the congregation for judgment. And the cities that you shall give shall be your 6 cities of refuge, and you shall give 3 cities beyond Jordan," that's the Transjordan, "and 3 cities in the land of Canaan," the Cisjordan, "to be cities of refuge. These 6 cities shall be refuge for the people of Israel and for the stranger and the sojourner among them. Anyone who kills any person without intent may flee there. But if he struck him down with an iron object so that he died, he is a murderer." So we've got a distinction being made here. There is the manslayer or manslaughter, and then there is the murderer or homicide. If he struck him down with a stone, tool, that could cause death and he died, he is a murderer, and the murderer shall be put to death. Or if he struck him down with a wooden tool that could cause death and he died, he is a murderer, and that murderer shall be put to death. The avenger of blood himself shall put the murderer to death. When he meets him, he shall put him to death. And if he pushed him out of hatred, or hurled something at him, lying in wait so that he died, or in enmity struck him down with his hand so that he died, then he who struck the blow shall be put to death. He is a murderer. The avenger of blood shall put the murderer to death when he meets him. But if he pushed him suddenly without enmity, or hurled anything on him, without lying in wait, or used a stone that could cause death, without seeing him, or dropped it on him, so that he died, though he was not his enemy and did not seek him harm, then the congregation shall judge between the manslayer and the avenger of blood in accordance with these rules, and the congregation shall rescue the manslayer from the hand of the avenger of blood, and the congregation shall restore him to his city of refuge, to which he has fled, and he shall live in it until the death of the high priest who is anointed with the holy oil. But if the manslayer shall at any time go beyond the boundaries of his city of refuge to which he fled, and remember, we just talked about those boundaries, right? About a half a mile around the city. So if he goes beyond those boundaries, and the avenger of blood finds him outside the boundaries of the city of refuge, and the avenger of blood kills the manslayer, he shall not be guilty of blood. For he must remain in his city of refuge until the death of the high priest, but after the death of the high priest, the manslayer may return to his land of his possession. And these things shall be for a statute and a rule for you throughout your generations and all your dwelling places. If anyone kills a person, the murderer shall be put to death on the evidence of witnesses. But no person shall be put to death on the testimony of one witness. Moreover, you shall accept no ransom for the life of a murderer who is guilty of death, but he shall be put to death. And you shall accept no ransom for him who is fled to the city of refuge, that he may return to dwell in the land before the death of the high priest. You shall not pollute the land in which you live, for blood pollutes the land, and no atonement can be made for the land for the blood that is shed in it, except by the blood of the one who shed it. You shall not defile the land in which you live, in the midst of which I dwell, for I, the Lord, dwell in the midst of the people of Israel. Did you see the turn that passage took there at the end? You read along and you're like, okay, case law, case law, case law. We're getting really nitty-gritty here. You know, if it was an accident, if it was a rock, if it was a piece of wood. You know, it just keeps on getting more and more detailed, and God very carefully circumscribes the circumstances and how these events shall take place. And then when we get to the end of it, we find out why. Because God values life. And when blood is unjustly spilled, even if it's an accident, then the land is polluted by that injustice, by that destruction, and justice must be done. God requires that something be done about that, because he is dwelling in the midst of that people, and that's the most important thing about that people, that he is in the midst of them. We spent weeks looking at how important it was to set up the camp of Israel so God could dwell in the midst of them. Now we have something very like that happening in anticipation of them entering the land of promise, the land of blessing. If you want to be blessed, you can't let these things slip. Life is important to God, and unjust blood spilled in the land pollutes it. And God will judge that. God will withdraw blessing. God will discipline. And so he wanted his people to treat these sorts of things as those among the gravest, and to be most careful with this. These people were to be set apart as holy unto the Lord. One of the commentators I read put it this way: the divine presence cannot abide in a land polluted by murder. And so we have here provision made to handle that. One of the most interesting things about this passage is this idea of the avenger of blood. Did you guys notice that as we read through that? What is the avenger of blood? Who is this guy? Well, the avenger of blood was actually a custom not just in Israel, but all throughout the ancient Near East. It was a person designated by the family, often the nearest relative, who would pursue the killer and himself kill him. All right, can you see feuds starting up and going on generation after generation after generation here? Now, what God does is he takes this Middle Eastern custom and he incorporates it into the law. He says, okay, this is what's here and it works. But if you're going to use this system, it's going to be on my terms. The avenger of blood is capable of removing the pollution from the land. And God dictated this for all of mankind way back at the beginning with Noah, right? Whoever sheds man's blood, by man shall his blood be shed. Okay? Murder, premeditated murder, is supposed to be responded to with the taking of that life from almost the very beginning. This is what God has commanded for all of mankind. And so that command makes its way into the law. And it is the justice that God requires of his people. And I would suggest that it is the justice that he requires of every government that has ever existed or will ever exist on this earth. And any government that does not follow that command that God gave almost at the very beginning is actively disobedient against God, and their land is polluted with blood. Now, none other of the lands of the world is the dwelling place of God, like Israel was in these Old Testament times. We're not on the same terms with God as Israel was, but the land is still polluted, and God still looks upon that polluted land. So this avenger of blood was a device that God incorporated into the law to allow justice to be done so the land didn't have to be polluted. But what I found most interesting is that the word for avenger of blood here in Numbers chapter 35 is the same word that we find in the book of Ruth for the next of kin, the kinsman redeemer. And depending on how you read the context, you interpret it just a little differently. Hang on to that thought. We're going to use that as an analogy later. But it's just a really interesting feature of the language that it can go one way or the other. The avenger of blood and the kinsman redeemer. Same word. Same basic background to the idea. Same next of kin thing that's going on. So how does all of this homicide law or manslaughter law work in the context that we have here? Well, the guilty one who has committed murder must be slain. No family members outside of this person may be slain. This was never to degenerate into the feuds that I mentioned earlier. But homicide is to be responded to with capital punishment, to put it in terms of our legal system these days. If the intention was to, through this act of violence, harm or kill a person, and thus the person dies, then that person who committed the homicide is himself to be pursued and executed. In the case of accidental death, which we would call manslaughter, this was not punishable by death, but it was still a polluting act, an unjust death. And so there still are measures or penalties for it in the law of Moses that had to be abided by. And in the case of both the murderer and the manslaughterer, no ransom could be paid. You couldn't make restitution, monetary restitution, and get off the hook. These things are not about the rights or the wrongs done upon the person or upon that person's family. Ultimately, the taking of a human life is against God, because every individual is an image bearer of God. And so when a man's blood is spilled, when a human's blood is spilled with intention or even accidentally, an image bearer has died, and that must be dealt with in a certain way. And so we've got these cities of refuge where if the matter was under debate, if witnesses had not yet been collected, if there were disagreeing arguments in the case, then everyone who was involved in this situation would go to the city of refuge, and the leaders of the cities of refuge were whom? Leaders within the tribe of Levi, right? Because these were 6 of the 48 cities designated to the Levites. And so the tribe of Levi, the clans within the tribe of Levi, would hold court. And they would hear arguments, and the congregation that was there would provide a verdict. Sort of like a jury trial. I don't know exactly how it looked like, but it was more or less a large sort of a jury trial. And then the verdict of that trial would be carried out. If the verdict was this was manslaughter, not murder, then the person who had done the killing was required to exile into that city until the death of the currently standing high priest. And then after that man's death, he was free to go back to his home. If the verdict was this was not accidental death, this was not manslaughter, this is murder, then the avenger of blood, that member of the family, that next of kin, would carry out the execution right there, immediately. So 3 cities on one side of the Jordan, 3 cities on the other. And we see here that human life, by God's estimation, because we are all image bearers, is important. Unjust taking of a life is an affront to God, not just to the person murdered or to the person's family. The law that I mentioned earlier that God instituted with Noah is Genesis chapter 9, verses 5 through 6. God takes unjust killing very, very seriously. David, in his arrangement of the death of Uriah, deals with this a little bit. In Psalm 51, we have, in the first 4 verses, an interesting application of these ideas. Have mercy on me, O God, according to your steadfast love, according to your abundant mercy, blot out my transgression, wash me thoroughly from my iniquity, and cleanse me from my sin. David had lusted for a woman who was not his wife. He had coerced her into his bed. And then he had arranged for her husband to be murdered so that he could add Bathsheba to the many women that he already had. This is a series of sin, a series of infractions and breakings of God's law, which should have resulted in David's execution according to the law, right? I mean, from what we just read, David's life should have been over for the adultery and also for the murder of Uriah. So he says to God, have mercy on me. I know I'm supposed to die. Verse 3, I know my transgression and my sin is ever before me. Verse 4, against you and you only have I sinned and done what is evil in your sight, so that you may be justified in your words and blameless in your judgment. Didn't he sin against Uriah when he had him murdered? Didn't he sin against Bathsheba, coercing her into his bed? Didn't he sin against his other wives? David's problems here are kind of hard to calculate, aren't they? How can he say against you and you only have I sinned? I think David has this in mind, what we're talking about this morning. I have arranged the death of an image bearer. It is an affront to you. I have polluted the land with blood. And only you can make this right. The only way I can make this right is to go find Uriah's next of kin and say, here I am. Drive it in. That was the only way David could make it right. And so he says to God, I don't know what to do. A little later in the psalm, as he continues to deal with this issue, we find him saying in verse 16, for you will not delight in sacrifice, or I would give it. You will not be pleased with the burnt offering. David couldn't offer a sacrifice. There was no sacrifice for murder. The blood that needed to be spilled wasn't some lambs, some goats, or a bull's. The blood that needed to be spilled was his own, according to the law, according to Numbers, chapter 35. He didn't know how to deal with this. So when human life is treated without importance, the land in which that life is becomes polluted. Way back at the beginning, first murder, Cain, jealous of Abel's recognition by God, unwilling himself to change, murders his brother. What does God confront Cain with? He says, the blood of your brother cries out from the ground. Abel's blood polluted the ground, and it needed to be dealt with some way or another. And so here in the people of Israel, the avenger of blood is called, according to this law, to purify the land of the one who initially spilled the blood. So what if someone is acquitted of homicide? What if it said, well, it's an accident? He still stands guilty of manslaughter. And we read earlier the provisions that are made for that in verses 24 through 29. Image bearers are still precious. And the loss of life, even an accidental one, needs to be dealt with under the law. And so until the tenure of the high priest concluded, that one must remain in the city that had declared his verdict. And if he left it, his blood was on his own head. Now, provisions are made because we all know how well justice works when sinful people are involved in it, right? It doesn't. Sinful people who get their hands upon the levers of justice pervert it. And so God includes some protections here. He says, only at the mouth of 2 witnesses or more shall these things be brought to pass. Only upon solid evidence was this case law to be activated. And then what about what about murder that is undiscovered? You're just walking through your fields one day, and there's a dead body. And clearly that person was murdered. The marks of death upon them show that this was a violent death. And so an investigation is taken up by the authorities in that area. And no one is specifically discovered. And there are no witnesses to it. And so the case law in Numbers chapter 35 can't be activated. What's to be done? What are we to do? Leviticus chapter 16. Did I skip that? Yeah, Leviticus chapter 16, which we won't take time to go to this morning. But Leviticus 16 prescribes measures to handle that. In truth, the justice that God requires for his people is very different from what we are used to today in America, isn't it? Capital punishment under God's laws, and that from the very beginning in Genesis chapter 9, was applicable in a number of cases. Restitution, and boy, I had sections that we were going to go into to talk about other nuances, but we're way out of time. But God required restitution in a number of cases for theft, for property destruction, for carelessness. And then also there's the entire principle of an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth included in the law. It really looks like God's system of justice is about retribution and restitution. These 2 things. And that is what is to be in mind if we want a godly system of justice. Retribution for the wrong done, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Or if man's blood is shed, then by man his blood also shall be shed. And then also restitution. And restitution, most of the time in the law, is not simply returning the lost goods to the person from whom you stole it. Rather, it's returning it threefold, in some cases sevenfold. I do not think that we here in the United States, or any nation in the whole world, which at one time in the past, or in the present, or in the future, is largely Christian, is ever the same kind of people of God that Israel is. What I mean to say by that is that the provisions here are not required for us. But I do think that there are principles here that ought to be applied in any nation which wishes to have justice. Our nation, not so much. And it starts with a faulty principle. It thinks that man is good. And so if he does something wrong, you can train him out of it. Restitution and retribution understands that without God's intervention, man is evil. And the only thing that's going to deter him is consequences. And the only thing that really helps him is submission to God. So nations around the world, including our own, would do well to draw their systems of justice